going to switch to Dr. Stephen Bittle, who's going to present on understanding work-related suicide and his current study. And I would like to welcome him. He is a full professor in the Department of Criminology at the University of Ottawa. His research focuses broadly on crimes of the powerful and corporate crime, with particular interest in corporate criminal liability, corporate manslaughter, corporate corruption, and work-related suicide. He's currently completing SSHRC-funded projects dealing with corporate corruption in Canada and work-related suicide, as well as preparing a book-length manuscript on corporate manslaughter law and its reform. Hi, Steve. Are you ready and able to share?
I am. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. I'm just going to try to share my screen. I'll either share my screen or disconnect myself. It'll be one of the two.
Oh, well, no risk to that.
No. Slideshow. Can you see that?
Oh, yes.
Good. Okay.
So now
good.
Well, start. Yeah, perfect.
There we go. So, yeah, thank you for having me today. I'm here to talk a little bit about some exploratory research that I'm doing on work-related suicide. And, you know, anytime this is one of the first times I've talked publicly about some of the initial results in relation to this study. But I do find it important when talking about this subject to start by recognizing that it is a difficult subject and can and is triggering for some people. So on that point alone, I think it's important to say that if anybody feels after today's discussion presentation that you find yourself feeling distressed or in need of support, that you should, I strongly recommend that you reach out to a trusted friend or a family member or a mental health professional who can certainly provide you with assistance and guidance. I always think that's important to start with that kind of recognition of that issue. So when we're talking about suicide and work, you know, there's a couple of things at play that I believe are important to kind of set the context. That is, on one hand, work plays a really prominent role in people's lives, provides much needed income, and for many, a sense of pride from doing a good job and contributing to society. At the same time, however, for many people, work can be difficult, stressful, and even dangerous. And while there is a considerable research documenting the problems associated with stress and anxiety-inducing working conditions, the differences between healthy and toxic work environments, and various workplace health and safety matters, largely missing from the research is consideration of the extent to which work contributes to deteriorating mental health, leading in some cases to suicide. So it's an extremely under-researched topic, excuse me. And so there are some studies from various jurisdictions in Australia, United States, France, Japan, India, and Taiwan that have reported alarming increases in the number of work-related suicide in recent decades. But as I said, it remains a hugely under-researched phenomenon. And specifically, there are a few studies that can explain why work-related suicides are on the rise at this time, their causes, why they're increasing at this particular moment, and what these suicides signify in social, economic, political, and legal terms. And so really, as a result, we have inadequate bases to determine appropriate and effective strategies for mitigating this phenomenon. So, you know, briefly, what do we know? Well, you know, existing research talks a lot about deteriorating working conditions that many people here will be familiar with, right? So some researchers argue that changes to employment relationships in recent decades offer a lot of insight into work-related suicide and related tendencies of governments to individualize responsibility for workplace mental health. Sarah Waters, who's a researcher from the UK who does a lot of work in this area, has argued that deteriorating working conditions and increased job insecurity are precipitating factors in work-related suicide. Waters, along with her colleagues, argue, and this is a quote from them, when people feel they no longer have a voice in the workplace, they protest in other ways, including in the most extreme cases, by killing themselves. So work has become very demanding and precarious. You know, neoliberalism, with its commitment to private enterprise, maximal corporate profits, minimal state regulation of business, and hyper-individualism that prioritizes personal wealth and accomplishment over collective solidarity, has profoundly changed employment relations. In addition to stagnating wages, work is increasingly demanding, precarious, part-time, low-paying. And again, as Waters and others note, precarious work alone contributes to increased stress, anxiety, sleep disorders, burnout, and in some cases, once again, suicide. And coupled with this, I think we need to recognize an erosion of workers' rights and protections, including reduced union representation, which puts workers in a difficult position when attempting to realize their already limited protections. So for me, when I approach this topic, I look at work-related suicide as a social phenomenon. And I want to note this kind of before I start talking a little bit about my own study. And from that, I mean, it's something that transcends personal circumstances or the medical model alone to consider the broader conditions within which individuals exist. So it's about the social conditions, including workplaces. And workplaces as a contributing factor is a significant focus of my work, which give rise to suicide and suicide ideation. I think there's a tendency to see work as an insulating factor when it comes to suicide, for example, that it helps protect from suicide and suicide ideation, and that might be the case in some instances. I'm more interested in the extent that working conditions are a contributing factor to suicide and suicide ideation. So my own research focus. Well, my entry into this topic came through some research that I was doing mainly on occupational health and safety issues. And as was noted earlier, more specifically in relation to criminal liability for negligence in the workplace leading to serious injury and death. So most of my background is in relation to research on the Westray law. And back in 2017, when I was doing some work as an academic in residence with the United Steelworkers Union, I was doing some research in which we were trying to estimate the number of work-related fatalities that go beyond compensation statistics to try to generate a more true reflection of the nature and extent of workplace fatalities in Canada. And as part of that is where I became aware of this growing body of research that was raising issue with the growing concerns of work-related suicide. And so part of that work that we did there with the United Steelworkers was to take research from Australia and France and look at Statistics Canada data on suicides generally to come up with a very rough estimate to say that there's a possibility that there are anywhere from 400 to more than 700 work-related suicides annually in Canada. But that was just basically an estimate based on existing studies, and it was very preliminary, and it really struck me that this was an area in need of research, which led to this particular study. And so my research, which is funded by the Social Sciences Research Council of Canada, is exploratory in nature and asks a series of just general questions to try to get a sense of the nature and scope of this phenomenon. So I'm asking things like, has the prevalence of work-related suicide increased in recent years? What is it? What types of employment or employment relationships are associated with suicide and suicide ideation? What responsibilities do governments and employers bear in addressing work-related suicides? And what legal and policy changes are required? And to me, these are essential questions, given that how we think about or how we understand work-related suicide shape how employers and governments respond, or in many instances do not respond through law and policy. So I'm in the midst of a series of data collection strategies here, which includes an online survey, in-person interviews with those who have an understanding of issues relating to work-related suicide, so health and safety experts, practitioners, union labor representatives, regulators, government officials, and policymakers. And we're looking to gather insights on the causes and consequences in existing laws and policies and prevention strategies. We're also undertaking an analysis of existing laws, policies, employer practices, and compensation decisions in relation to this. At this stage, we're not including family members and loved ones of those who have died by suicide, if only because of the exploratory nature of the study. We're still at an early stage to figure out the nature and scope of the issues, but also, mindful of the need to be careful in building relationships, so it's not just to parachute in on people and ask them very difficult questions about very personal matters. Okay, so I want to stress that these are some very early results that I want to share with you today, and they mainly come from our online survey that that's allowing us to gain an understanding of the nature and scope of work-related suicide. And we're also have started looking at some compensation cases or appeal cases in which there's been a denial of compensation in cases where work-related suicide has occurred or an attempted suicide has occurred. But I want to stress that these are only preliminary results, and just to give a snapshot of the things that we found thus far. I think it's important to say that simply because when you have a survey, it gives a sense that there's some kind of representation going on here, and we certainly are not claiming that our results are representative. They're simply a snapshot and a product of the people that we've spoken to or the people that have replied to our survey, and again to try to give us a better sense of just the issues at hand. The thing that I always feel is a bit strange when presenting to a group like this, because so many of you, live these things on a daily basis and are intimately familiar with these things, is that many of the themes that we found in our research are going to be very familiar to you. Right? The informal discussions that I've had along the way with people as we're doing this research is that these are issues that many people have been talking about for years. Maybe in one-offs and maybe not in a systematic manner, but there have been discussions and concerns about work-related suicide, particularly growing concerns in recent years. So many of the themes that I'm going to identify are probably very familiar to you. And in that way, I find that my responsibility or my role as a researcher is to make a modest contribution to the issues by bringing the discussion to the fore, and in the process, hopefully not only raising further awareness about it, but helping inform relevant legal and policy related discussions. So again, we have this online survey, which is ongoing, and I see that there was a link sent to the survey if anybody's interested in taking it. I'm reporting today on the results of 60 respondents. We have more than 100, but we're still going through the process of some of them are not completed. There's various reasons why somebody might not finish the survey. They might just open it, not complete it, or forget about it. So this is just a preliminary look at 60 completed surveys. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the appeals decisions that I mentioned earlier. Okay, so what can we say at this point about the results? Well, probably not surprising to, again, many of you, there is an overwhelming, about 90% of the respondents that we have at this point believe that work-related suicide is both under-recognized and a serious issue that has increased in prevalence in the past decade. And when asked about what work-related suicide is, work-related suicide is not a widely discussed topic within society generally, and I think that's a reflection of the difficulties we have as a society more broadly to talk about suicide. And while work-related suicide is often conceptualized narrowly in official terms, if at all, and by that I mean typically it is linked to, in many cases, a primary injury that somebody might experience, for example. They can no longer work, they suffer from depression and suicide ideation. There are instances where work-related suicide is recognized in those cases and of course in first responders. But the respondents that we have for our survey thus far are really clear that it's a much more complex issue and that it includes many more things than just the kind of narrowly defined types of work-related suicide that we've seen at this point. And I'm just going to give you a sense of some of the answers that we have in that regard that are part of the survey. So, people recognize that work-related suicide could be when a worker completes suicide at their place of employment and their death is attributable to their working conditions. When they die by suicide and they're not at work because of the aforementioned work-related injury or illness, and that is attributable to their working conditions. When a worker dies by suicide and it subsequently becomes known that their working conditions played a role in their death. When there's an unusual number of suicides amongst particular workplaces or within particular working environments. And when someone dies by suicide away from the workplace and their family members or loved ones might communicate that work played a contributing factor. Or even when somebody complete suicide in their uniform or work clothes when they die by suicide, even when they're not at work. When it comes to causes too, there's also a general sense that there's no single factor that causes or that is related to work-related suicide, but that there are several overlapping issues that need to be taken into consideration. And one respondent put it nicely by saying that those are intersectional factors that need to be considered. And again, just to give you a sense of some of the more common answers that we received when talking about the kind of multifactorial or the intersectional factors related to work-related suicide, it ranged from things like post-traumatic stress, work-related injury or illness, bullying, harassment at work, stressful working environments, abusive supervision, emotional demands at work, alienation at work, burnout, and just a general lack of control over working conditions. And same when it comes to the types of employment. Most commonly, people think about first responders in the military, and rightfully so, and those are ones that show up in our results as well. But there's also just a general recognition across the board that there could and should be consideration given to healthcare professionals, social worker or care workers, even mental health practitioners, construction workers, and in some cases, farmers and the stresses that are involved in their lives as well. So after we think about causes and types of employment, we start to turn our attention to, well, has there been an increase, which again, respondents believe that there has, and why that's the case. So when we asked why there's been an increase, of course, lots of people spoke to issues about increasing pressures and demands from employers, the growing precariousness of work, and like so many things in our lives over the past number of years, COVID has played a significant role in creating the conditions or in the conditions of people's workplaces, and in some instances, issues of suicide and suicide ideation. And I just want to read a few quotes to you here that kind of bring home the complexity of these issues in terms of the increased causes, but yet I think raise really important issues. And here's one from a respondent, where on the survey we have sections where people can leave comments in addition to answering some standard questions. And one quote is, I anticipate COVID had a major impact in some areas, such as healthcare, where there was little relief for staff and post-traumatic stress issues. In addition, work itself is more precarious in some areas, and there is limited public discussion about this, so people feel particularly isolated. And another quote, increasing demands on workers from employers, increasing harassment and violence aggravated by the COVID-19 pandemic, lack of laws requiring employers to prevent psychosocial hazards at work. So that last quote is a nice way to start talking about some of the response measures that people spoke to within our survey as well. And one of the things that becomes clear when we're starting to look at the preliminary results, and again, this is not surprising for many that are with us today, is that there was a strong indication that governments in Canada are just not doing enough to address the issues of work-related suicide. And a majority of respondents believe that employers need to be held to account when we're addressing the issues, and again, related to work-related suicide and suicide ideation. And again, I just want to read a few quotes that give some life to these numbers, to these results. And here's one. In general, governments are reluctant to attach costs to employers for unsafe work and workplace injuries. Essentially, there's a regulatory capture in play, although other societal factors are also relevant. This is particularly the case when the injury entails long latency period or otherwise murky causality, and thus the state can justify inaction. The proximate cause of suicide is worker behavior, and this tends to crowd out root cause analysis. There is also a belief that those who die by suicide are not in their right minds, which is then used to blame the worker and ignore the structural factors that contribute to the suicide. Another quote is that there are protections in place, but no enforcement. Employers are not held to account when they do not adequately protect workers from foreseeable hazards. And a final quote on this point is, I believe that too often workers who die by suicide are assumed to have had other mental health issues that were equally, if not wholly, responsible for their suicide or suicide attempt. I do not believe in general that employers accept responsibility for stressful workplace environments, nor are held to account by any level of government for fostering workplace cultures that are built on stress and burnout. So what kind of accountability measures do respondents believe that we need? And again, we can see a whole range of issues that many people would be familiar with that could come into play that would start to address these matters in more detail. But I'll give you some of the kind of more common answers, or the top answers, if you will. And on that point, we got feedback on the need for an independent investigation into suicide and its possible causal factors. And I think that's a reflection of the frustrations that people have, that there just isn't enough investigation into these matters and as they relate to working conditions. Other examples or other recommendations included mandated external oversight to ensure that employer changes work or working conditions linked to suicide, to ensure that workers' families and their loved ones are adequately compensated, and in appropriate circumstances, criminal prosecutions for companies and managers for creating the conditions that lead to these situations. Perhaps not surprisingly, but very importantly, hazard assessments were an issue that came up in our results, and a strong sense that there needs to be more hazard assessments, psychosocial hazard assessments in the workplace. And many people, when asked about whether they believe that their employers or employers that they know about conduct hazards assessments and engage hazards which might give rise to suicide or psychological harm, 70% indicated that no hazard assessments were completed. And I can be quite sympathetic about that myself as somebody who sits on my own employer's joint occupational health and safety committee. It continues to amaze me about how, when we have discussions about psychosocial hazards, that it seems to be one of these issues that employers are reluctant to take on to address. And often it's raised as being too complex of a matter for us to address in any meaningful way. So it's a serious area of struggle for sure. There was also, again, grave concern about inadequate compensation in cases involving suicide and suicide attempts. And I'm going to just read a couple more quotes again that give some further meaning to this. Similar to the interpretation of our health and safety laws, psychosocial causal factors are often bypassed. We see this with the application or lack thereof of mental health related policies in general. For example, the lack of chronic mental health stress claims approved by the WSIB in Ontario. The lack of recognition is an extension of our government's and compensation system's failure to acknowledge psychosocial hazards as hazards. And another quote, this is such a gap. In Ontario, the burden of proving causation is very high. Employers seek to limit liability rather than use the compensation system for its purpose, to support the health and well-being of workers. In addition, many workers are not aware of supports available and may not be aware that filing a claim is possible. And overall, there's just a concern about a lack of employer initiative to have adequate policies relating to suicide prevention as it relates to workplaces. So those are just some of the kind of general findings that we have in relation to our survey at this particular point. And again, we're still in the early stages. I think that the process of us getting the survey out and giving people a chance to answer is something that's going to take us some time and patience to make sure that enough people get the opportunity to participate. But as I said earlier, we're also looking at some appeals decisions in relation to cases where there's been a denied claim in relation to a work-related suicide or a suicide attempt. And the reason for us doing that is we just want to get a sense of how the issue is being framed in official terms and how this might contribute to a narrow understanding of the phenomenon. And we're in the process of examining 40 appeals decisions, mainly from Ontario, where compensation is denied, again, to get a sense of that. And when we do look at this framing, we see a number of things that reiterate many of the things that are raised in our survey. And one of the first things that we see is this language of commit really prevails throughout the decisions that we've looked at. And this is the concept of quote unquote commit suicide. When I first started taking on this project, is not something that I really gave much thought to But, you know, it's a language left over from the days when attempting suicide was committing a crime. So you're committing suicide, and that's very much a language that's been within health and safety circles has been thankfully jettisoned. But this language of commit was very common within these appeals decisions, and I think not to say that people are using them purposefully, but it does kind of set the narrative or the tone for how we're thinking about these things. And I think contributes to a narrowing of the definition of work-related suicide. The second thing that we found is, again, consistent with what we see from our survey results, is that there's a real individualizing effect to these decisions, and that it was on the worker for not having done enough to help themselves. And there are many instances, these forensic-like examinations of a worker's entire life. And in some cases, they go back all the way to a worker's childhood, and determining that there was something wrong with them. And that evidence, that prehistory of mental health issues or problems in a person's life, are used to dismiss claims about work-related suicides or to dismiss or downplay the role that work plays. Standard proof is also an issue that comes out in the sense that there needs to be, you know, in official terms, there needs to be a clear link between the suicide and work. And in one case where a worker died by suicide after being involved in a truck driving accident in which the driver of the other vehicle tragically died, and that worker experienced depression and eventually died by suicide. In that particular case, we saw this, you know, this reference back to the worker having never said anything to their employer about feeling that they were suicidal or had suicide ideation. And I raise that as an example just to illustrate that there's always this kind of concern that there has to be that connecting evidence, direct connecting evidence, in order for it to be recognized as a work-related suicide, and that's rarely the case. And so what we see overall, that work is rarely seen as a causal factor, or at the very least, there's not that exploration of work as a potential causal factor to the extent that we see when we're talking about the individuals involved. So next steps. Well, we're going to continue at this point with the survey. We're going to start into semi-structured interviews to be able to go into more depth on these matters and get more feedback and input from people about the nature and extent of the issues. And I'm also in the final stages of negotiating a research agreement with the Solicitor General of Ontario to examine coroner's files. Again, with the goal being to get a sense of how work-related suicide is being framed within these different processes. And I'll stop it there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Steve. It's all very thought-provoking, and great that you're looking into this to see. It is so hard to get past the individual circumstances, but to try and look for, I mean, I put our stress assess survey in there. It's not, there's not a direct link necessarily between workplace stress, but I guess we think it can't help but help everyone in the workplace, and maybe in the process help others, help individuals who are suffering more so or have lost hope. I don't know. I don't see any other questions. It is. And so how long is the survey going to be open? I did put the link in the chat, and it was in the event bulletin as well. Is there any time that you're inviting people to participate by?
I'm going to leave it up for the foreseeable future across the summer into the fall, just to continue to collect as much data as we can.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I think we'll switch then now to Dr. Vicki Chrismond,